So, ladies and gentlemen, in my recent podcasts, I've been going over some true crime stories about murders and resulting executions in Canada, and have been centering on New Brunswick. Now, this case is quite interesting because not everybody really talks about it anymore, because there's been higher profile murder cases involving Acadians, English people. But the execution of the Hamilton brothers, called by many people at the time bad characters, really polarized the Fredericton region and across New Brunswick back in the late 1940s. Now, George and Rufus Hamilton's eventual execution for murder for bludgeoning a taxi driver to death with a hammer really was a tale of many factors at play. The rough and tumble generations they grew up in, as part Mi'kmaq and part African Canadian, led to the public basically almost assuming things before the trial even ended. Now, some of the information I'm providing today was first published in a very interesting blog by Professor Michael Boudreau, who is a professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at St. Thomas University. Now, this essay is part of the Acadianists, which is a journal of the history of the Atlantic region. Now, this was first posted on November 7th, 2018, and Boudreau says in the article that the execution of George and Rufus Hamilton in Fredericton at 2 a.m. on 26 July 1949 was the last execution in New Brunswick's capital, and it also, in his opinion, underscored constant backhouse assertion that the legal system played a principal and dominant role in creating and preserving racial discrimination. Now, according to published reports, the duo lived on the margins of society due to their poverty and lack of formal education. In addition, what was called at the time their Negro racial extraction further compounded their marginalization in a predominantly white community. Similar, being what was known as colored at the time, meant that in the eyes of many residents of the capital city, the leap from committing petty crimes to murder was, while shocking, also understandable, if not inevitable. Indeed, many Canadians at the time believed that blacks, especially black men, were prone to violence, and as a future award-winning author said in his very important books on the subject, George Elliott Clark noted, racialized murders were seen to represent inferior cultures. Now, the double hanging of the brothers at what was then the York County Jail, now home to Science East, which is adjacent to the Royce Farmers Market, was for the murder of a white taxi driver, Norman Bourgogne, spelled Burgoyne, not Bourgogne like the regular spelling. And this murder was considered by many to be just conclusion to what the police had characterized as one of the most brutal murders in the province's history. According to Boudreau's article, the press depicted 34-year-old Bourgogne as a model of respectability. Because he was a long-time resident of Fredericton, he was well respected, being a veteran, a devoted husband, a father of 3 children, and of course a successful businessman. According to published reports in the TJ at the time, Bourgogne's battered body was discovered locked in the trunk of his taxi on a lonely woods road outside of Fredericton on Monday, 10th of January 1949, 2 days after he had gone missing. Following brief investigation, a tip from a witness who had informed the police that George and Rufus were driving a car that resembled Bourgogne's taxi, the Hamilton brothers were arrested on 16th of January and held in custody until Rufus's trial began in May. But ladies and gentlemen, at the time, the windmills of justice ran pretty fast in New Brunswick. There were many murder cases would occur in a given year, come to trial, and lead to execution in that same calendar year. Especially like the Joe Richard case, which was the last execution for murder in New Brunswick up Dalhousie, Charlotte region a few years after. Now, according to the published reports and what Boudreau noted, George and Rufus Hamilton lived precarious lives. George, who was 23, lived with his wife and 2 children in a 2-room house with no running water in the black settlement at Barker's Point on the city's north side. Now, according to the 1941 census, York County, which included Fredericton, had 294 Negro residents, and Fredericton's population was 10,062. George, who had a grade 3 education, did not have stable employment, and by his own admission, he survived at times by stealing and gambling. Rufus, aged 22, held a series of menial jobs, and before he came to live with his brother, had been incarcerated in the infamous Dorchester Penitentiary. The trial judge, J. Michaud, in his charge to the jury, described George and Rufus as bad characters, to put it in common parlance. I would say bad eggs. Both men, according to the information presented at trial, desperately needed money and devised a scheme to bump someone off, drag them into an alley, and rob them. But George surmised that this was a risky proposition, especially in broad daylight. So instead he suggested they call a cab, have the driver take them to a lonely place, and then knock him unconscious and take his money. Now on Friday, 7 January 1949, the brothers called a taxi from a payphone and requested that he be picked up at the then Legion on Queen Street. When the taxi driver arrived, however, George, who recognized Burgoyne, apparently had second thoughts about their plan. George later admitted, "I had the intention in my heart to get some money because I was squeezed. But George insisted that when I saw it was Norman Burgoyne, I was scared and never did it." Despite George's trepidation, he and Rufus climbed into Burgoyne's taxi and asked him to take them to a bootlegger. After driving to various places, Rufus grew impatient with George's reluctance to carry out their plan, so when they stopped at a home and George went to inquire about purchasing some homebrew, Rufus took a hammer that George had brought with him and hit Burgoyne twice on the head. When George returned to the cab, he found Burgoyne's body slouched over in the front passenger seat, and when he asked Rufus what had happened, Rufus allegedly said, "You lost your nerve, so I hit the son of a bitch. I didn't want to go home without some cash." The provincial pathologist that was assigned to the case concluded that Burgoyne had died as a result of the blows that he had suffered to his head. Now, George and Rufus had divided Burgoyne's cash evenly between them over the course of the weekend to use the money to purchase alcohol, food, and clothes. This, coupled with the fact that the Hamilton brothers drove Burgoyne's taxi, labeled by those in the press as the debt car, to Minto and then to St. John, with his body still in the truck, did not endear them to the eyes of many Fredericton residents. As the popular Daily Gleaner proclaimed, this was the most deliberately planned and brutally executed capital crime in the history of the provincial capital. The racial overtones in this case for many were at times blatant. George and Rufus were usually described in the press as the Colored Brothers or the Barker's Point Negroes, while Justice Michaud noted that Rufus had purchased a large quantity of liquor on Saturday, which led to a good drinking party, and apparently the whole of the Negro settlement had a merry afternoon. In addition to infantilizing the members of Fredericton's black community, Michaud's statement implied that they were indifferent to the murder of a white resident of the city. There was also subtle signs of racism that blacks in Fredericton encountered. When asked why he had abandoned the taxi just outside of Fredericton, George replied that he knew he could not return to the city in Burgoyne's taxi. He said, "I was scared to death to come up to Fredericton because it was known by many people who would have been suspicious if they had seen him driving a big car." George believed that as a black man, his every move would garner a degree of suspicion and surveillance, and in essence, George was keenly aware of his place as the other in the New Brunswick capital. The jury, which, according to press reports, was comprised of men of superior intelligence, took less than an hour to deliver a guilty verdict with no recommendation for mercy. although juries could recommend mercy, thus bringing this tragic drama to a close. As a headline, the TJ declared, Negro brothers pay for murder of N.P. Burgoyne. George and Rufus's execution attracted hundreds of curious members of the local and surrounding communities. Every adjacent rooftop, line fence, window and woodpile were at a premium, as the crowd, which ranged from babes in arms to greybeards, choked the entrance to the goal yard and vantage points for a glimpse of the condemned Negroes. And as George and Rufus were led to the gallows, the crowd cheered and execution was heralded by the tolling of the St. Dunstan's church bell. The belief that their execution was a fitting end to this case was echoed in an editorial that appeared within days of the hanging, noting that Burgoyne's murder was planned and carried out with extraordinary callousness. The Telegraph-Journal hoped that the Hamilton brothers' fate would act as a warning in any of like mind. Now, to many, the execution of George and Rufus Hamilton is another example of the Canadian justice system's desire to punish what was understood to be black people's inherently criminal behavior. Now, in the study I've done in the case, and a lot of media members like myself, they consider the execution of the brothers, not say a railroad of the case, but the jury and the judge was prejudiced in many ways against the black, or what was considered the black Mi'kmaq combined community of Fredericton and of other communities in the province. It was very common for the Mi'kmaq to have many ancestry in their relatives, including Jewish, French, Scottish, African, Canadian, black residents of Canada who had moved from other black countries, Haiti, Jamaica, different countries. The mentality of systematic racism exists in 2020 on many levels, but in the late 1940s, early 1950s, to many it was seen as accepted policy that a person being of black or mixed extraction or mixed color, as we would call it, would be more likely to commit a crime, and therefore the systemic racism, even though they might have had some semblance of not being guilty, there was no question that the brothers had accepted the fate, but their quick trial and execution and the quick result by the jury was pretty well their mind was made up whether the facts presented a level of mercy or not. Both persons being executed for murder only one person had committed, tied into a kind of a U.S. system where people have been executed for participating in a crime. Now, do I believe that the both brothers should have got executed for what they did? I'm an expert on modern Commonwealth law. I could not make an opinion whether they should have been executed or not, because that was a jury trial at the time. They confessed to the murders. They provided information that led to the conviction of the crimes. But for me, I'm not a supporter of the death penalty, and this is another case where there could have been another black person with less evidence could have been executed for the same amount of information, because it was good that the information was provided and the confessions, but what type of charter rights or Miranda-style rights do these two people have? There was maybe he confessed because he knew that as a black people they would automatically be found guilty. Who knows? Like I said, that's for the history books to talk about. But the book we're also talking about, which is won the author many recognition, is by George Elliott Clark. It's called George and Rue. It talks about the author's skeletons in the family closet. He wrote about the brothers, according to the CBC Books website. He wrote about him both repelled and intrigued by his ancestral cousin's deeds, which he only learned about from his mother shortly before her death. And Clark set out to discover just why the kind of forces reduce men to crime, violence, and ultimately murder. Now, his findings eventually took shape in the Governor General Literary Award-winning execution poems, and culminated in the recognized tome George and Rue. Now, the death of any person in New Brunswick by violence is a tragedy. The execution of people for their crimes can be analyzed to death. We look at the Benny Swim case in Woodstock. We look at certain criminal cases that occurred throughout New Brunswick before and after capital punishment was taken off the books in Canada in 1976. There was murders in my home region of Lorne, Beldoon, Hamilton, Dalhousie, that if this occurred in the 1950s would have led to the gallows. It was crimes that deserve execution, and these people in cases were either brought down to manslaughter or second-degree murder. I'm not going to get into these cases. These articles I did in those cases are archived in the Hamilton Tribune and Dalhousie News bound copies at our offices in the North Shore. I'll let history tell that story. But for me, execution never solved anything in Canada, because execution would lead often to more executions. We saw a diminishing of executions in New Brunswick in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. With the Joe Richard case, for some reason, it kind of left a bad taste in people's mouths, not because he wasn't guilty of the case, but because of the way that people were being executed. People's execution were being botched. People of not the best mental faculties were being executed rather than spending life in prison. The Truscott case really shook up a lot of people, even though it was in New Brunswick. But when a young gentleman under the age of 16 is sent to death row, you know that the process was incorrect. I'm glad in 2020 that the death penalty is not in the books in Canada, because the last aspect of a person's life should be forgiveness and compassion. You can never forget what a person done. But the person that killed my mother in a car accident, indirectly vehicular manslaughter, I forgave that person. I know what forgiveness is all about. I don't blame that person for what he did, because he woke up in the morning, he never said, I'm going to kill this person's mother with my vehicle. But like I said, it was a different time, and is New Brunswick or is a racist province comes down to it when it comes to people of color or Aboriginal people. Not for me to say, because I wasn't living when the abject racism was occurring, the heavy racism. In 2020, at least we're discussing the fact that racism cannot be accepted in any shape or form with a fair trial. Now, do I believe the brothers in Fredericton got a fair trial? I'll let that time and let you make that decision when you listen to particulars of the case. Have a good day. Bye.